Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. When you really think about it, we are rarely in situations where we are completely safe. We are out and about in the world, not generally worried that anything bad will happen to us. Dashing home from work, running errands, taking the kids to ball practice, dropping by the grocery store for that one last thing. And during all of these moments, we have willingly exited the safety of our homes. There is an unspoken power when a door separates you from the rest of the world. Today's case starts with a man knocking on a door under false pretenses. He was pretending to be something he was not, and he was able to trick his victim into opening the door. Barbara Mackle could never have dreamed what the next 4 days of her life would be like. Welcome to episode 204, The Kidnapped Heiress, Barbara Mackle. Barbara Jane Mackle was born on October 19, 1948, to parents Jane and Robert Mackle in Florida. She had one brother, Robert Jr. Barbara's childhood was probably pretty different from yours and mine. It was very privileged and lavish, filled with private schools, summer homes, and debutante balls. Barbara's family was extremely wealthy and relatively famous, at least in Florida. Barbara's father was a successful land developer. It was a family business started by Robert's own father. Back in 1910, Barbara's grandfather, Frank Mackle Sr., had started a real estate and development company. About 35 years later, by 1945, Frank Sr.'s 3 sons had taken over the business. There was Barbara's father, Robert, and his 2 brothers, Elliot, who was older than Robert, and Frank Jr., who was younger. Together, the 3 men purchased, developed, and profited off nearly 20 communities in Florida. If you have spent some time in Florida, you might have heard of some, like the Key Biscayne area or the Pompano Beach Highlands. Over time, the Mackle family business would go by a few names and pursue several projects. However, the crux of their business plan remained constant. They would buy large swaths of Florida land. Then they would build a nice bunch of homes or hotels on it. Next, they would advertise this new, exciting property for a shockingly affordable monthly price. Something like, pay this easy-to-swallow amount of money now and the land is yours to use for this still very low amount of money a month. We're all familiar with installment plans today, but at this time in the mid-1950s, this business strategy was very innovative. Around this time, the Miami Herald reported that a down payment for a vacation home from the Mackle brothers was about $300 to $600. That's somewhere between $3,000 and $6,000 today. Then the monthly payments were between $30 and $40, which is around $400 today. Even when you account for inflation, these prices for brand new Florida vacation homes were affordable to many. The Mackle brothers told the Miami Herald that they believed a family could buy one of their vacation homes for the same price that a standard Florida vacation would cost. So how did the Mackles even make money at prices like that? Well, they were banking on the longevity of the market. The Mackle brothers hoped that families who vacationed in Florida would later retire there, and a lot of them did. So by the time little Barbara came along, her father was making big money. Through the many mergers and iterations of the Mackle Company, Robert was usually named the treasurer and secretary. Typically, his younger brother Frank Jr. was the president, and his older brother Elliot the vice president. By December 1954, when Barbara was 8 years old, the Miami Herald reported that the Mackle Company was the largest home building firm in Florida. 5 years later, in August of 1959, the Herald reported that the Mackles had sold about 75,000 lots. At this point, Frank, Elliot, and Robert Mackle's names were symbolic of the current Florida's land bonanza. Although we don't know exactly how much Barbara's family was worth, we know they were multimillionaires. They had at least $2 million in assets. And $2 million in the 50s and 60s, that's more than $20 million today. So yeah, Barbara's childhood was a little different than ours. She was in the public eye very early on. The local newspapers reported when the Mackles attended a play at the theater. They kept tabs on birthday parties and summer vacations. To put things in perspective, once in July of 1950, the Miami Herald did an entire piece on Barbara's Uncle Elliot. He was moving his family 15 miles, from Coral Gables, which is a rich Miami suburb, to Sunset Island 2, another rich Miami suburb. And that was news. If ever there was an equivalent to the show Keeping Up with the Kardashians for Florida in the 50s and 60s, it was the Mackle family. Minus all the ridiculous drama, of course. Barbara's family also owned a summer home in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Barbara, her mother, and her brother spent a fair amount of time there. However, Robert usually stayed in Florida for work. And the Mackles were also devout Catholics. They regularly attended the Church of the Little Flower in Coral Gables. Barbara's father, Robert, also famously loved to golf, especially at the Riviera Country Club golf course, which was conveniently located right next to the Mackle family home in Coral Gables. Robert was also very into horse racing. He became the president of the Horsemen's Benevolent and Protective Association. He and his brothers owned their own stables specifically for racehorses. Barbara's mother, Jane, was a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania native. She had relocated to the Miami area when she was 15 years old. Her family owned a hotel, as well as several coal mines. Jane married Robert in 1943 when she was around 26 years old and he was about 32. At that point, Jane had already earned her bachelor's in economics from Duke University, and she had worked for the FBI during World War II. That might have been how she and Robert met. He was in the Navy. In fact, their wedding was a military affair, taking place in Washington, D.C. As Mrs. Robert Mackle, Jane was an active philanthropist. She worked with the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which is an organization dedicated to improving communities through volunteer service. She also marched to raise awareness for polio. She was involved with the American Cancer Society, the March of Dimes, and a member of the Gilded Lilies of the Easter Seal Society. And she was an avid bridge player. And naturally, their daughter Barbara was a high-achieving young lady. Barbara Mackle was a very intelligent young woman. She began her school years at St. Teresa's Parochial School. Then she spent her freshman year at the Immaculata LaSalle High School. After that, Barbara transferred to the Everglades School for Girls, at the time an elite private school. While at the Everglades School for Girls, Barbara was a rising star. She was elected senior class president. A year before that, she had won the Smith College Award. As a sophomore, she had won the National Education Development Test Award. She was the treasurer of the 20 Little Working Girls. That's an organization that focuses on volunteer work. She was also president of the National Honor Society, and she was editor of their yearbook. Not surprisingly, when Barbara graduated, she was the valedictorian. Obviously, Barbara was also a hard worker. According to her classmates, she was always studying. She never let a break between classes or study hall go to waste. And Barbara was also active in other activities like tennis. In 1966, 17-year-old Barbara was chosen as a debutante for the 4th annual Debutante Cotillion. These cotillions are coming out society parties for young women between the ages of 16 and 21. According to the Miami Herald, all chosen debutantes, of which there were 15, were from outstanding families. Barbara was clearly an amazing, accomplished young woman. I don't want to diminish that. But she was selected to be a debutante by a committee, and the head of that committee was none other than her own aunt, Mrs. Elliot Mackle of Sunset Island 2. Barbara's friends and classmates described her as mature, sophisticated, well-coiffed. Some people believed Barbara was shy until she got to know someone. But Barbara's closest friends would claim that wasn't quite right. She wasn't one to avoid people or keep her head down. She was both discerning and friendly. She just wasn't one to waste her words. A classmate of Barbara's told the Miami Herald she was not at all impressed by her background, her social status. That's what impressed me about her. She just went out of her way to make everyone feel the same. In the fall of 1966, Barbara enrolled at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She was a member of the Delta 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 sorority, and she majored in economics. According to those who knew Barbara, by her junior year, she was seriously considering transferring out of Emory. She wanted to go to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I wonder if Barbara was motivated to transfer so that she could be closer to her very good friend, Stuart Hunt Woodward. Stuart was 1 year older than Barbara. He was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, though most newspapers list him being from Philadelphia. Just like Barbara, Stuart had also attended Emory University to study economics, which is where he and Barbara first met. After Stuart graduated from Emory with his bachelor's degree, he went on to earn his MBA from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Finance. And that's where Stuart was when Barbara was considering her college transfer. At this point, Barbara and Stuart were not dating. Originally, Barbara's mother had referred to Stuart as Barbara's fiancé to local journalists, but Stuart told the papers that this was incorrect. He said he and Barbara were good friends, but insisted there was no romantic involvement. On Friday, December 13, 1968, 20-year-old Barbara was in the midst of her final semester exams, and she was also really sick with something like the flu. It had come on fast. The week before, Barbara was just fine. She even went Christmas caroling at a local old folks' home with her sorority sisters. But now, she had taken a turn for the worse. Her throat was so hoarse she couldn't speak. Her nose was running, she had a headache and nausea. Later, she would be diagnosed with a respiratory infection. That same Friday, her mother, 51-year-old Jane, had checked into a motel less than 3 miles away from the Emory campus. She had come to Atlanta to take care of her sick daughter. The next day, on Saturday, December 14th, Barbara was taking her 3-hour economics final, but she couldn't finish it. She felt so sick that she had to leave early. Emory's medical center for students was full, so Barbara stayed at the Roadway Inn with her mother. She and her mother were there for several days while Barbara recuperated. At times, her temperature was at least 102 degrees. By Tuesday, December 17th, Barbara and her mother were still in the motel in room 137. The Roadway Inn itself was decent, but not a 5-star establishment. Barbara and Jane's room had 2 double beds and a color TV. At about 4 a.m. that Tuesday, someone knocked on room 137's door. According to Barbara and Jean Miller's book, 83 Hours Till Dawn, Barbara never heard the knock. But her mother did. As Jane went to answer the door, Barbara told her to stop. But the voice on the other side of the door was loud and demanding. It was a man who claimed he was a police officer. He insisted that he needed to talk to Jane and Barbara. He sounded convincing, self-assured. Jane could see through the door's peephole that he wore a visor cap with the words police printed on it. This supposed policeman said he was looking into an accident. Something had happened to a white Ford vehicle. There was a young man involved, and the young man was asking for Barbara. A white Ford was the exact kind of vehicle that Barbara's friend Stuart drove. He had recently visited Barbara and Jane at the Roadway Inn to make sure they were getting along okay. Worried that Stuart was in trouble, Jane opened the door. But it wasn't a police officer. A burly white man in his mid-20s walked in. He was holding a shotgun. According to Jane's initial accounts of all of this, a young boy was with this menacing man. He was around 12 years old and wearing a ski mask. The intruders forced Barbara to turn around. Then they covered her mouth and nose with a chloroform-soaked rag and tied her hands and feet with a white cord. They also tied Jane's hands and feet and put tape over her mouth. She watched helplessly as her daughter was carried out the door. Barbara was abducted at gunpoint while wearing a red and white checked flannel gown. And that's important because it was freezing outside, literally below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's all Barbara had on against the bitter cold. After the kidnappers left, Jane yelled for help. Even though they had taped her mouth shut, the adhesive had loosened quickly. Now the tape just hung off her chin as she screamed, but no one responded. Desperate, Jane maneuvered herself out to the parking lot. There she managed to open the driver's side door of Barbara's green Firebird, even though Jane's hands and feet were still bound. Each step was more of a hop, and she had to open the car door backwards. But she got in and then pressed her body weight on the car horn. She had to get someone's attention. The Roadway Inn bookkeeper woke up to this blaring car horn, and she was livid. She thought a patient had escaped from the nearby VA hospital and was causing a ruckus. It had happened before, so the bookkeeper called the night clerk. The Roadway Inn night clerk went to the parking lot to see what was going on. He spotted Jane, and she must have been quite a sight. Her hands and feet were still bound. She was frantic and bruised. And still, the night clerk said, according to the Miami Herald, "Hey lady, shut up. You'll wake all the guests." He wasn't even swayed when Jane yelled, "They robbed me and took my daughter." The night clerk just figured this was some sort of mother-daughter argument. After Jane explained again, the night clerk finally helped her out of her bindings before making a hasty exit. At last, around 4:11 a.m., Jane called the DeKalb County Police. 5 hours later, at 9:10 a.m., the phone in Robert Mackle's den rang. It was the kidnapper. He instructed Robert to dig 6 inches under a rock at the edge of his Coral Gables property. When Robert did, he found a test tube. Inside of that test tube was a 3-page typed ransom note. The note was incredibly detailed. It explained that Barbara had been buried in an underground box. The box was equipped with enough provisions for Barbara to stay alive for 7 days, but no longer. If Robert ever wanted to see his only daughter alive again, he would have to pay $500,000. That's $4.4 million in today's money. When you think about the logistics of kidnapping for the purpose of ransom, there are a lot of moving parts. You have to get the money in cash, and that cash would need to be untraceable. Then you'd need a way to transport the money from point A to point B, and that's harder than it sounds. Depending on the type of bills, the bag could weigh up to 1,000 pounds. But Barbara's kidnappers had seemingly thought of everything. The ransom note outlined that the $500,000 was to be arranged in 25,000 $20 bills, none of which could have consecutive serial numbers or be older than 1950. They were to be rolled into $1,000 bundles, and all of the cash had to be stored in a specific Samsonite suitcase. The note indicated that as soon as Robert had the money, he was to put a want ad in the Miami Herald paper. The ad needed to have this exact language, quote, "Loved one, please come home. We will pay all expenses and meet you anywhere at any time. Your family." Next, Robert would drive to the designated drop spot. The kidnappers even told Robert which of his cars he needed to use, a recently purchased 1969 Lincoln. Then Robert was to wait for a light to flash 3 times. That was his signal to leave the money. Afterward, he would be given the location of his daughter. Around this time, the FBI became involved in Barbara's case, and from the jump, Robert made it very clear to the FBI agents he was going to cooperate with the kidnappers. Robert would do anything to get his daughter back. He would not risk putting her life in danger. And the FBI accepted that. They were confident that they could find Barbara's abductors after the money had changed hands. So Robert set about to do exactly as he was instructed. He got a business loan from his bank to cover the ransom. The bank formed a special team to assemble the money exactly as the kidnapper had demanded. And the second that was ready to go, Robert put the ad in the Miami Herald. But the ad did not get published immediately. So on Wednesday, the kidnapper mailed a package to Robert Mackle's home. It included a Polaroid photo and one of Barbara's rings. In the photo, Barbara was lying in a coffin-like box with a sign across her chest that read, "Kidnapped." The kidnappers then contacted the Church of the Little Flower. This was the church the Mackles attended regularly. They enlisted 32-year-old Father John Mulcahy, a priest whom the Mackles had never met, to be an intermediary. This way the kidnappers could avoid contacting the Mackle family directly. They were certain that by now, the FBI had wiretapped all of the Mackles' phone lines. And they were right. The FBI had the Mackle home completely bugged. While the FBI and Robert Mackle were arranging for Barbara's safe return, the press was going wild. Everyone was glued to their TVs watching the saga of the beautiful Florida heiress who was kidnapped. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Despite the fact that Barbara's kidnapping made front-page news, the papers actually had very few details. If the FBI had had it their way, the news would have zero details about the abduction. For Barbara's safety, they wanted to keep the whole thing under wraps. Who knew what could happen if the kidnappers became spooked by coverage? But right now, the news of Barbara's abduction was leaked. Apparently, a DeKalb County police officer gave the information to a radio newsman. The newsman, Bob Neal of WQXI, said they thought it was public record. Bob told the Miami Herald, "We didn't know anything about a secrecy lid." This problem of FBI versus local police officers would persist throughout Barbara's case. At one point, a policeman told journalists, "I never in my life have seen anything so tightly socked in." Meanwhile, the Miami Herald reported that an FBI agent told a local officer, "You people talk too goddamn much." It had been 2 days since Barbara was taken. Her abductors had seen Robert's ad in the paper. They had heard from their go-between, Father Mulcahy. The kidnappers had every reason to believe that Robert Mackle was going to cooperate fully, and so they were ready to tell him where the drop location was for the $500,000. At the same time that Robert picked up the phone, 20 FBI agents roamed Miami. They were all given specific instructions not to interfere with this transaction. But guess who else was roaming the area? Miami's very own local police officers. No one had said anything to them about not interfering. At 4:05 a.m. on Thursday, December 19th, the kidnappers called Robert Mackle. They told him where to go. He drove 5 minutes to the location and followed the directions to a T. He went to the land-facing end of the Fair Isle Causeway. He placed the 100-pound suitcase over the seawall, and he left it resting on a patch of land that would remain dry until higher tides came later that day. Shortly after Robert left, the kidnappers arrived by boat to grab the money. Then they carried it north along the seawall. They had planted their getaway car in a nearby neighborhood. But their getaway car was causing a hubbub. Several people had called the police already about the mysterious Volvo. It was parked in an area where usually no cars were parked. Plus, others had heard a boat rushing by in the early morning hours, and still more had heard dogs barking at people walking through backyards. So Miami police officers were on the lookout in this area. They had no idea that a high-stakes ransom transaction was occurring just a few miles away. They had no way of knowing. The FBI had not told any other Florida law enforcement agency. So when the police officers saw two people carrying a suitcase get into this mysterious Volvo, they approached them. And then the kidnappers jumped out of the car and ran. The officers chased them on foot. One of the kidnappers had a duffel bag and a carbine, which is like a rifle but with a shorter barrel. He fired 2 shots at the officer, and the officer returned fire but missed. The second kidnapper had a duffel bag, a carbine, and a suitcase full of money, and they dropped all 3 as they ran. In the end, both kidnappers escaped into the darkness. The one with a duffel bag and carbine had scrambled into a dense mangrove thicket. The other, who had dropped all of their items, had vanished. The officers were left with a duffel bag full of diving gear, an unfired carbine, and a suitcase filled with $500,000. Later, both the FBI and the Miami Police Department would spend some time finger-pointing about all this. The spokesman for the Miami PD complained that they would have left well enough alone had the FBI been more transparent. The FBI complained that they didn't have enough time to alert the Miami authorities. And that is true. Between the time that the kidnappers called Robert and when the actual drop-off happened, only a few minutes had passed. It was a quick exchange. They couldn't just blast out the information on a police radio either. Before they received the call from the kidnappers, the FBI wasn't even certain the drop-off would be in Miami. They had had suspicions that it would occur at the location of Barbara's kidnapping, back in Atlanta. Ultimately, both the federal and county law enforcement agencies blamed the kidnappers for making the plan go awry. They believed that the kidnappers were too obviously suspicious, as in, had these criminals been sneakier, everything would have worked out fine. Meanwhile, Robert Mackle had returned to the same seawall where he had left the money. It had been 2 hours and the kidnappers had not given him Barbara's location yet. Robert was worried something had gone wrong. It was then that the FBI relayed the bad news to Robert. The kidnappers had not gotten their money, and they had gotten away. According to the Miami Herald, Robert was on 2 days of no sleep. He was exhausted and began sobbing. He said, "My God, they're going to kill my daughter." Even though the FBI and Miami PD had accidentally bungled this ransom handoff, there was one small silver lining. Now investigators had the kidnapper's car, a blue 1966 Volvo station wagon with Massachusetts license tags. The Volvo was registered to a 28-year-old George C. Deacon, and with a little investigation, the FBI soon learned that George C. Deacon did not exist. But a prison escapee named Gary Stephen Christ did exist, and he had been using the alias George C. Deacon to pose as a research technician for the University of Miami. Gary Stephen Christ was born in April of 1945 in Aberdeen, Washington. According to the Atlanta magazine, Gary spent most of his childhood in Pelican, Alaska. Gary's father was a salmon fisherman, and his mother helped his dad with the business. But Gary wasn't interested in following in his family's fisherman footsteps. He was too busy getting in trouble. As a child, Gary was known for being a petty thief. And when his parents would go out to sea for work, Gary often terrorized his babysitters. According to the Atlanta magazine, he once fired a shotgun over a babysitter's head. In 1959, Gary was 14 years old, and that's when he and a friend went on a crime spree that landed him in actual legal trouble. Then in the early 60s, Gary stole a car, which was doubly bad because he was already on probation. After this incident, Gary was forced to go to a reform school in Ogden, Utah. He would attempt to escape from this school twice. In 1961, the Ogden Reform School released Gary, and then, according to the Miami Herald, he graduated from high school in Sitka, Alaska in 1963. Shortly after graduating high school, Gary moved to Redwood City, California. There he met a young woman named Carmen Simmons. They first crossed paths at a roller rink right before Christmas of 1964. And just 4 months later, 18-year-old Gary married 17-year-old Carmen in March of 1965. Soon after, they had their first son together. But by 1966, Gary was in prison at the Dual Vocational Institution in Tracy, California. He was sentenced to 5 years for auto theft, but about 8 months into his sentence, on November 11, 1968, Gary escaped. Gary and his cellmate used a hacksaw blade to cut the bars of their prison window. They carefully put the bars back so no one would know they were gone. They also put dummies on their cots. During the escape attempt, a tower guard saw Gary and his cellmate push a metal scaffold to the fence. The guard watched as Gary and the other guy threw a piece of wood across the top of the inner fence to the outer fence. At this, the guard fired a warning shot, but the inmates kept going. Then the guard fired at them again. Gary and his cellmate were about 146 yards away. That's more than a football field. Still, his cellmate was killed. But somehow, 20-year-old Gary managed to jump over the outer fence and into the night. and thus 28-year-old George C. Deacon was born. Gary assumed this new identity, moved his growing family to Massachusetts, and started his new life. His wife Carmen took on the alias Dorothy, and Gary/George found a job at MIT. Yeah, I'm not kidding. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology hired an escaped convict with an assumed name. Gary worked as a lab technician for their National Magnet Laboratory, and he was well regarded there. People referred to him as highly intellectual. His supervisor told the Atlanta magazine that Gary was one of the brightest lab technicians he'd ever worked with, especially considering his lack of formal training. According to Gary's wife, Carmen/Dorothy, all of Gary's expertise came from his time in prison. Apparently, he'd spent the bulk of it studying electronics, so much so that, according to Carmen, Gary never felt out of place, not even while working alongside some of the smartest people in the U.S. But Gary was not the easiest to get along with. Colleagues remember that Gary would get testy when he bit off more than he could chew, and neighbors sometimes referred to Gary as bitter. He wanted a more expensive lifestyle than his current paycheck would allow. Carmen would later tell the Miami Herald, Gary doesn't want to lead a mediocre life. He wants to be remembered. He always wanted to make an impact on the world he lives in, and he likes nice clothes and cars. She said Gary had a big ego, and numerous people remarked on Gary's love for money. It was well known that he resented having to live in low-income housing and drive half-broken cars. In the summer of 1968, Gary, his wife, and his now 2 young children relocated to Miami. They moved into a blue and white trailer into a trailer park on 14th Avenue. Gary told his Massachusetts friends that he was moving across the country to work with what he loved most, the sea. And so Gary began a new job as a research technician for the University of Miami on June 1st, 1968. He worked at their Institute of Marine Sciences. And that's where he met another young woman. Her name was Ruth, and she was a 26-year-old graduate student. Ruth Eisman Shire was born on November of 1942 in El Hatillo, Honduras. According to those who knew Ruth, her father was a scientist and her mother was a doctor. She practiced dentistry and medicine, and Ruth herself was very smart. She earned her Master of Arts in Chemistry, Pharmacy, and Biology from the National University in Mexico City. And by the time she came to the United States, she spoke Spanish, German, French, and English. Ruth's English became excellent after she had a brief stint in Washington, D.C. In the late 60s, Ruth went to work for the Pan American Union, where she was a biology researcher for the Department of Scientific Affairs. While there, she made $7,000 a year. That's $62,000 in today's money. After staying on that path for about a year, she obtained a fellowship from her employer. They were going to pay her to complete some additional schooling at the University of Miami. She would study biology as a graduate student. So Ruth enrolled and made her way to Miami in the fall of 1968. And at first, she excelled there. She made good grades, and she was well liked. But then things began to fall apart. It all started with a cruise. According to the Atlanta magazine, in September of 1968, 25-year-old Ruth and 23-year-old Gary just happened to go on the same cruise. It was a 2-week work cruise. They would conduct scientific research for the University of Miami Institute of Marine Science. During those 2 weeks, Ruth and Gary became very close. They flirted constantly. And when Ruth couldn't drive a scooter to get around a location, she rode on the back of Gary's. They were also seen sailing together. Gary and Ruth's relationship had quickly become romantic. And by the time the research vessel returned in early October of 1968, Gary had revealed his criminal past to Ruth. And they were ready to start a life together. So in mid-November 1968, Ruth emptied out her Miami bank account. In that same time, her grades at the University of Miami plummeted. This was because Ruth was focused on a new time-consuming project. She was helping Gary with his wildly complex plot to kidnap Barbara Jane Mackle. How else would these two lovebirds jumpstart their lives together? But apparently, this kidnapping plot had been in Gary's head for quite some time. His actual wife, Carmen, later told the Miami Herald that Gary had dreamed of kidnapping someone for ransom ever since he was 13 years old. Recently, Gary had told Carmen that he didn't want to do that anymore, that it was childish, and he had moved on. But Gary hadn't moved on at all. He had just moved on from Carmen. On Monday, December 16, 1968, Gary told his wife Carmen that he didn't love her anymore. But she had no idea about his new girlfriend, Ruth, and Gary didn't tell her. Instead, he asked her for a separation. According to Carmen's interviews with the Miami Herald, she didn't believe in divorce. But until then, Carmen took their 2 kids, who were 3 years old and 8 months old, and moved in with her parents in Redwood City, California. At the same time, Gary told his neighbors that he was going to travel around Southwest Asia for 8 months. And Ruth told her friends that she was going to do some traveling that December. She had a friend in North Central Florida with a ranch, and they were going to ride horses. But of course, there was no trip to Asia, and there was no friend who owned horses. Ruth and Gary were just in the process of preparing for one of the most famous crimes in Florida history. In the weeks leading up to Barbara's abduction, Gary and Ruth were busy. Gary built the wooden box that Barbara would be kept in at his trailer. The box was about 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. That's approximately the size of a coffin. Inside the box was a battery-powered light, small amounts of food and water, an air pump, and 2 pipes for ventilation. The pipes would be barely visible above the ground, and the top of the box would be fastened down with screws. Also, Gary and Ruth spent a considerable amount of time stalking Barbara. According to the Miami Herald, in the days before Barbara was abducted, Gary and Ruth drove around Emory University. They asked other students about Barbara. This is how they found out what kind of car Stewart drove, the detail that lured Barbara out of the motel room. They chose the location where they were going to bury Barbara. It was an isolated woodsy area, surrounded by barbed wire fencing and littered with beer cans. And of course, they had to get that test tube note to Robert Mackle's backyard in Coral Gables, Florida. Once everything was ready, they put their plan in motion, forced their way into the roadway inn, and kidnapped Barbara Mackle. Barbara's mother, Jane, had mistaken Ruth for a 12-year-old boy, which makes sense. Ruth was about 5'3" and slender, and at the time Jane saw her, she had been wearing a ski mask. When they grabbed Barbara, Gary injected her with a tranquilizer. Ruth was supposed to do it, but she refused. She felt more empathy toward Barbara than Gary did. As soon as Ruth realized Barbara was sick, she tried to convince Gary to leave some nose drops with her in the box, but he said no. All the while, Barbara tried to talk her kidnappers into letting her go, but her words fell on deaf ears. And as soon as she was sluggish from the tranquilizer, Gary and Ruth took those Polaroid photos of Barbara to send to her family. They also took some photos of themselves with the same camera. These Polaroid photos, including some of Barbara, were left in Gary's blue 1966 Volvo station wagon, the same Volvo that was now in the custody of the FBI, since both Gary and Ruth had fled the scene and dropped their suitcase of money. After the couple escaped, authorities monitored all of Miami's major exitways. They watched highways, side roads, airplanes, buses, and trains for any sign of Gary or Ruth, but they didn't find them. The next day, on Friday, December 20th, Robert Mackle published the following message to Barbara's kidnappers in the Miami Herald. I had nothing to do with the action Thursday morning of the Miami police who tried to arrest you and recovered the money which I had left for you. I regret that you did not get the money because my only interest is the safety of my daughter. I pray that you have not harmed my daughter. I did everything you told me to do, and I had nothing to do with the accidental appearance of the Miami police on the scene. Please contact me again through any channel. I will do anything you ask so my daughter will be freed. By the time this plea was published, Robert's money had already been handed off to the kidnappers. Well, one of the kidnappers at least. Gary was on his own now. Apparently, when Ruth started running away from the police on the morning of Thursday, December 19th, she didn't stop. And Gary had no idea where she went. He hadn't seen her, but he couldn't stop his kidnapping plot. He was in too deep. So later that same day, Gary reached out to Robert again. They organized an exchange at the Coral Park Shopping Center around midnight that night, and this time, Gary got his hands on the suitcase with $500,000. And then he told Robert where Barbara was buried, as promised. On Friday, December 20th, 1968, after spending about 83 hours buried 18 inches underground in a box, 20-year-old Barbara Jane Mackle was found. And although she had lost about 10 pounds, she was largely unharmed. Her first words were, "How are my parents?" When Barbara first heard the FBI agent's footsteps, she had assumed it was her kidnappers returning. She told the Miami Herald, "I had been there so long, I really didn't care." So Barbara began knocking on the coffin. She wanted to help whoever was up there, kidnapper or otherwise, find her. And eventually they did. However, the FBI agents didn't think to bring shovels, so digging Barbara out with their hands and a tree limb took longer than expected. They had to pry open the top of Barbara's box with a tire iron. Gary and Ruth had buried Barbara under a tree-filled hillside about 20 miles from Atlanta, Georgia. Unbeknownst to Barbara, she was less than a mile away from a residential neighborhood. In fact, a police officer lived nearby. He drove his car right by where Barbara was buried when he went to work each day. At the time Barbara was saved, she was still wearing that same red and white checkered nightgown that she'd been kidnapped in. And she also had a sweater. According to the Weather Bureau, Barbara would have experienced temperatures somewhere in the 50s while in the box. The dirt would have insulated her from the worst of the cold. Still, that didn't mean Barbara's time in the box was comfortable. Her battery-powered light had gone out within 3 hours, so she was trapped in complete darkness. She had no concept of time. One of the fans she had been provided made an awful repetitive noise, so she had turned it off early on. She also had a hard time drinking the water that Gary and Ruth had provided for her. According to Barbara, it tasted funny. And the box was cramped. Barbara, who was fairly tall at 5'10", was uncomfortable. It might have been 8 feet long, but it was only 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. She couldn't move around much at all. When she was rescued, she couldn't walk. The FBI agents had to gently lift her from the box. Moments later, the famed FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, called Robert Mackle himself. He told him that Barbara was safe and sound. Shortly after, Barbara's doctor would tell the newspapers that she was very cheerful and had developed no fears as a result of this ordeal. She told the Miami Herald, "I just feel wonderful, I really do." Robert, Jane, and Robert Jr. were overjoyed to hear that Barbara was safe and coming home. Later on, Robert would attribute his resilience to his faith in God. And Robert Jr. would tell reporters, "This will be the best Christmas we've ever had." And by December 23rd, Barbara had indeed returned to the Mackle family home in Coral Gables. So step one of the authorities' job was complete. They had found Barbara. But there was still step two. They needed to find her kidnappers. And so the search began. The FBI already knew they were looking for Gary Stephen Christ and Ruth Eisman Shire. That information was easily obtained from the fingerprints covering Gary's recovered Volvo. Plus, there were those Polaroid pictures in the Volvo, as well as Ruth's passport, all strong evidence tying both Ruth and Gary to Barbara's abduction. The FBI also already knew that Gary and Ruth had snipped off a padlock and stolen a boat from the University of Miami Institute for Marine Sciences. That's what the couple used to drive up to the initial drop-off location. Law enforcement also knew that Gary was injured after escaping the police. When he crawled through the mangrove thicket, he had been cut by wayward brambles, and that day he went to Jackson Memorial Hospital for treatment. A doctor, not knowing who Gary was, had given him 4 stitches in his scrotum. The FBI was also in contact with people from all over Miami and Atlanta, many of whom had seen Gary and Ruth preparing to kidnap Barbara. They had also seen them arranging the first money drop-off. General store cashier clerks had watched Gary and Ruth purchase food. A caretaker saw them scope out where they would leave their Volvo. After retrieving the $500,000, Gary had immediately ran. He made his way west, toward the Gulf of Mexico. Initially, he and Ruth had planned to live out the rest of their days in Australia after getting the ransom money. They were going to buy a research vessel and create an encyclopedia of oceanography. But obviously, Ruth was gone now, so Gary moved on to Plan B. And Plan B might have worked, except for one random occurrence. Gary bought a boat for $2,300 cash in West Palm Beach. At first, the guy who sold him the boat, Dix Oliphant, didn't think much of this transaction. He wasn't at all fazed by Gary, who was using a fake name, sliding 115 $20 bills over the counter. Oliphant told the Miami Herald, "This is a screwy business. People pay you in all kinds of ways." But Oliphant's son had been watching the news, and he suggested that Gary could be one of Barbara's kidnappers. So on the off chance that they could help, Dix and his son contacted the FBI. By the time the FBI caught up to Gary, he'd made his way through the Okeechobee Waterway. At each checkpoint along the waterway, Gary signed his name as Art Horowitz. But it was too late. The FBI was on to Gary thanks to Dix Oliphant and his son. At one point, Harbor Patrol caught sight of Gary's boat, but then he fled north. And in a case of sheer bad luck, that Harbor Patrol boat sprung a leak just as they were gaining on Gary. At about noon on Saturday, December 21st, a Coast Guard helicopter crew watched Gary abandon his boat. He was going to hide on a tiny piece of land called Hog Island. Eager to catch Gary, some FBI agents borrowed a local man's boat. His name was Ed Pakulski. He owned a fish camp across the river from Hog Island. But unfortunately, when the FBI borrowed his boat, they forgot to secure it properly, and Ed watched his own boat plunge into the river. Finding Gary on Hog Island was an ordeal. Sure, they had him cornered with no way to escape, but finding one person who doesn't want to be found in a dense, forested area is tricky, especially on Hog Island, which was a swampy area with difficult terrain, and there were alligators and snakes. And the mud was awful. It was deep and sticky like glue. The authorities tried to bring in bloodhounds to sniff Gary out, but the dogs couldn't walk through the sludge. And Gary had come prepared with diving equipment. He wore a scuba suit and had some sort of breathing apparatus. So whenever Gary could tell the authorities were closing in on him, he would duck underwater until they left. By the time sunset hit, law enforcement agents knew they wouldn't find Gary in the darkness. The Charlotte County Sheriff told the Miami Herald, "We are operating on the assumption he is still out there. I don't see how he could have gotten off the island. I know I couldn't." At this point, the authorities adjusted their goals. They just needed to hold Gary on Hog Island until daytime. Then they could launch a line search of 125 officers. Until then, all of their helicopters turned on their searchlights. That way, if Gary tried to leave Hog Island, they would see him. Finally, after 12 hours of evading law enforcement on Hog Island on Sunday, December 22nd, 23-year-old Gary Stephen Christ was caught and arrested. They transported him to Fort Myers, Florida to be arraigned and treated at a local hospital. By 5 o'clock that evening, Gary had been booked in a Miami jail, and his bond was set, ironically, at $500,000. Then Gary was taken back to Georgia. Since that's where the initial kidnapping took place, Georgia would get first dibs, and maybe last dibs, because kidnapping was a capital crime in Georgia, so Gary could be facing the death penalty. Now on to Ruth. Because if catching Gary was tricky, catching Ruth seemed almost impossible. As soon as the first drop-off fiasco happened, she vanished, and for a long while, the FBI had no idea where she went. Right after they captured Gary, Ruth became the first ever woman to be placed on the FBI's most wanted list. Since the most wanted list's inception, almost every person on it had been captured within 131 days, except for 10 people whose charges were dropped. But Ruth looked like she might be the first to break the streak, because by Saturday, December 28th, the FBI admitted to the press that Ruth could be anywhere. One FBI spokesman said, "This girl is so plain-looking, she could buy a $20 long black wig and a $1 pair of sunglasses and get lost in a phone booth." And it was true. Ruth was known to change her hair frequently. Sometimes she was blonde, sometimes brunette. She could speak multiple languages, and she could pass as a woman or a small boy, depending on the situation. The public theorized that Gary had killed Ruth, but law enforcement suspected this wasn't true. Still, the authorities were willing to examine any angle. On March 2, 1969, 3 months after Barbara was kidnapped, the police wondered if they had found Ruth. Some snake hunters in the Everglades had uncovered charred skeletal remains, but this theory was disproven with additional forensic testing. 3 days after those remains were found, on March 5, 1969, Ruth was arrested in Norman, Oklahoma. As it turns out, she had arrived in Oklahoma on February 13th, 2 months after Barbara's kidnapping. We're not sure where she was in the interim, but we do know that she was now going by the alias of Donna Sue Willis. In Norman, Oklahoma, Ruth had gained the sympathy of an 18-year-old kid named John Ray. She told John she was 18 years old and running away from her physically abusive German parents. Ruth said these fictional parents lived in Edmond, Oklahoma, which is about 35 miles north of Norman. John took Ruth under his wing. He helped her find a place to stay with his friend, who owned a rooming house, and John connected Ruth to the owner of a small restaurant called the Boomerang. Right away, Ruth talked her way into a car hop gig there. By the time John realized that Ruth was not interested in him romantically, she was pretty well set up. She had a job that paid $1.25 an hour plus tips, and she had a room that she could afford. Plus, Ruth had also applied to be a nurse's aide at the Oklahoma State Mental Hospital. Within a few days, the hospital offered Ruth the job. As they did with all new hires, they took her fingerprints. And those prints were sent to the Oklahoma State Bureau and the FBI. Ruth's fingerprints were mailed on February 28th, and within the week, she was arrested. She too was held on a $500,000 bond and transported to Georgia. If she hadn't gone for that nurse's aide job at the hospital, she might have remained a free woman. Almost immediately, Ruth confessed to everything. By the end of May 1969, Ruth had written 2 letters to the Mackle family asking for their forgiveness. Ultimately, Ruth was sentenced to 7 years in a Georgia prison. But she received parole after just 4 years. Then she was deported back to Honduras. Gary decided to plead not guilty and go to trial, which was a bold decision considering the mountain of evidence. But Gary was full of bold moves. In the spring of 1969, he went for nearly a month with no food. He would only drink 2 gallons of water each day. He said he was on a hunger strike because he believed that his jailers were trying to poison him. But Gary's jailers were pretty sure he just wanted to be held in an easier place to escape from. After all, he had done it before. On Tuesday, April 22nd, Gary collapsed. He'd stopped drinking his daily 2 gallons of water, and his body weight had dropped from 210 pounds to 175 pounds. Eventually, the authorities relented and put Gary in the Grady Hospital in Atlanta. He was evaluated there for 3 weeks. On Monday, May 19, 1969, Gary's trial began. The prosecution had assembled more than 250 witnesses to potentially call against Gary. And Gary, on the other hand, hired a lawyer who was once an imperial wizard for the Ku Klux Klan. His name was James Venable. During the trial, the prosecution presented a rock-solid case. They proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Gary had masterminded the kidnapping of Barbara Jane Mackle for a $500,000 ransom. They had the Polaroids. They had his prints all over multiple vehicles, including the getaway boat. They had Ruth and Barbara's eyewitness testimony, and they even brought in the box that Barbara had been confined in. Meanwhile, Gary's defense team's argument was that Georgia law did not define the ramifications for kidnapping versus kidnapping for ransom clearly. Also, Gary's defense argued that the FBI spent too much money and resources trying to find Barbara and convict Gary. Gary did not testify on his own behalf. By the end of the trial, Gary's ex-KKK lawyer, James Venable, was just yelling. The Miami Herald wrote he was shouting almost incoherently during closing statements. He was red-faced and weeping. At one point, Venable cried out, "God help you and God pity people charged with crimes if you are gullible enough to believe this kind of evidence from the Boy Scouts of the FB and I." On the evening of Monday, May 26, 1969, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted 24-year-old Gary Stephen Christ of kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison. They granted Gary some mercy since he was not sentenced to death. The prosecution had requested the death penalty, but the jury was compelled by how careful Gary was to ensure that Barbara wasn't hurt. Gary, who had read a science textbook throughout most of his trial, was unsurprised. He told the Miami Herald, "No kidnapper who returned his victim alive has ever been executed, according to the World Almanac." He felt that if this jury had done so, it would disincentivize kidnappers to keep their victims alive. At this time, Gary was not optimistic about receiving parole, which he was eligible for in 7 years. He was reported by the Miami Herald as saying, "In the vague and distant future, when I have rheumatism and gout, I will step out of the prison doors onto a moving sidewalk, dodge the jet-propelled hovercraft, stumble around, and wonder how I got into the next century." But he was wrong. On May 14, 1979, after about 10 years in prison, 34-year-old Gary Christ was paroled. He had received a pardon after being accepted into a medical program in Mexico. He was going to be a doctor. And apparently that was enough for the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles. This, as you can imagine, caused an absolute uproar. People could not understand how Gary, who had literally written a book in prison about the crimes that he had committed, could be let out on parole. The next year, in 1980, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles would have a different parole decision deemed unconstitutional. As it turns out, Gary's parole wasn't the only questionable decision they had made recently. And as a result, Georgia Governor George Busbee made them create a better scientific approach to making parole decisions. But regardless, Gary was out. After he graduated from medical school in Mexico, he returned to the United States. First, he tried to practice medicine in Alabama, but they denied him. Indiana, however, did not. So in December of 2001, 56-year-old Gary opened up his own medical practice in Chesney, Indiana. He stayed there until 2003. Then his license was revoked. Apparently, Gary had concealed a disciplinary action that he had received as a resident doctor. In 2006, Gary was arrested again. He was found on a sailboat off of Alabama's coast with more than 38 pounds of cocaine. He also had an underground cocaine lab on his Georgia property. Gary pleaded guilty to these crimes in 2007. As a result, he was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. For a while, Gary was incarcerated at the Mariana Federal Correctional Institute in Florida. But once again, Gary received parole. This time it was in November of 2010. Today, Gary Stephen Christ is 78 years old and probably living in Georgia. As I mentioned, he did write an autobiography entitled Life, The Man Who Kidnapped Barbara Mackle. It was published in 1972, and I did not read that book, mostly because it's a whopping $141 on Amazon. Also, fun fact, his book has 1 Amazon review, and it's from Gary himself. He gave himself 5 stars and wrote, "The honesty of the author shines through the words, even though the author is an acknowledged criminal who has done an awful crime." Maybe Gary didn't know that we could see who writes the reviews. And as for Ruth, she is likely still in Honduras. She would be 81 years old. After her extraordinary ordeal, Barbara Jane Mackle went on to live a very happy and full life. In April of 1971, 21-year-old Barbara married 22-year-old Stuart Hunt Woodward at the St. James Roman Catholic Church in Philadelphia. They honeymooned in New England. They had 2 children together before Stuart passed away in 2013 at the age of 66. Barbara and Stuart had been married for 43 years and lived in the Vero Beach area of Florida. Barbara's story captured America's imagination. There were 2 TV movies produced about the case, The Longest Night in 1972 and 83 Hours Till Dawn in 1990. Even President-elect Richard Nixon stopped by the Mackle household on Christmas Eve of 1968. He was a close friend of the Mackle family and wanted to welcome Barbara home. During his visit, he mentioned to Barbara that she should write a book. And she did. In May of 1971, Barbara Jane Mackle and Miami Herald journalist Gene Miller published 83 Hours Till Dawn. Besides an impromptu interview that Barbara granted Gene during a photo shoot, this book is the only public statement Barbara has ever made about her abduction. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I don't accept suggestions on social media private messaging. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review. I'm on all large platforms like iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, and Audible. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.